What's on the docket today? What will we document?
Hello and welcome to Doll Doc. Today is the day we finally finish the Freaky February series, even though February is long gone. So let's jump right in. I always start a doll out by removing her factory paint with pure acetone, and for this doll I wanted to carve some of her features to be more mummy-like. So I go in with a marker to sketch out the areas that are going to be modified. And with an X-Acto blade I go and make the rough modifications. I then take epoxy sculpt and begin to add a little bit of detail, especially to the nose. I did fill in her eyes, which later I took out because I ended up wanting her eyes to glow. Once the epoxy cured, I began recoloring her skin with some alcohol ink. Now we need some skin for this mummy. I started out by making the same mixture I made for my zombie, which is a mixture of baking soda and liquid latex. I just kind of eyeball it until it becomes almost like a thick icing consistency. Once it's to the thickness I want, I then can start applying it to the mummy's face. I dip my sculpting tool into more liquid latex to help smooth out the paste. For her body, I just applied some liquid latex with a Q-tip, dabbing it over the parts that I wanted skin. Onto a plastic container, I made more sheets of skin like we made with the zombie, and these you can keep pretty thin. Once everything is dried, I began to wrap the sheets around the mummy. I really like the effect that this creates. The latex is still sticky at this point, so be careful not to let any of the limbs touch each other or the body. I watered down some brown alcohol ink with more isopropyl alcohol and then began to brush the color onto the body. I like how the alcohol ink actually seeps under the latex, creating some shaded areas. And if you ever get it too dark in places, you can always use more isopropyl alcohol to lighten up areas or correct a mistake. I also applied some more ink to her face. The brush I'm using to apply my alcohol ink is an old brush. You don't want to use a good brush for this because the alcohol will dry out your bristles. I used some isopropyl alcohol in a spray bottle to lighten up the brown some. At this point, I decided I wanted to add some interest to her face, and I went with some glowing eyes. So I popped out the epoxy sculpt that I previously put into her eye sockets, and I removed the back of the doll's head so I can stick in some LED lights. Looking at the face, she really didn't have the same texture as the rest of her body, so I went ahead and put a few more of our latex sheets around the mummy's head. When I finished recoloring the body, I gave her a good dust of baby powder to make sure her limbs wouldn't stick to each other. Part of the footage I lost was placing in these beads for her eyes, as well as a strand of LED lights. And I just placed the beads in with hot glue and ran the strand of lights through a hole in her head and glued them in place as well. For her sarcophagus, I cut out the pieces from black chipboard. I wanted something that was going to be durable but had a little bit of give to it so I could create the curves for the sides. Then I began gluing the side pieces to the base, just using hot glue. For the lid of it, I wanted it to be able to stick on with magnets, so that's why I have these little holes inside the lips. I made these top pieces as guides for my sculpting and to help not have to use so much clay. I ended up modifying them some because I realized I didn't need the hand pieces to go out that far. I'm gluing some paper over the magnets to keep them in place. I also mark which side of the magnet needs to be glued down to the lid and fill the gaps of the lid with aluminum. Now I took and did a little paper mache, which I used just a mixture of Elmer's glue all with some water and some scrap paper I had to create a base for the sarcophagus lid. Then I took some paper clay and began to mold details. I used paper clay for this prop to keep the lid lightweight. Also, if you end up having some paper clay that's a little too dry for sculpting, I found you can soak it in a mixture of glue water and it will soften the clay up and also create a kind of paper clay paste to fill in gaps and cracks. Once everything was dry, it was time for paint. I started out with a base coat of metallic copper. I used several reference images of sarcophagi to help me with my artwork design. I used metallic gold for some guidelines before adding any black to my sarcophagus. If I made a mistake with the gold, it was a lot easier to correct than having to correct the black paint. Once the black was finished, I began filling in the areas I wanted to be gold. I kept this layer pretty light in places where I wanted some of the copper to show through. Now to create some little designs with red paint. This paint wasn't metallic. I also added a wash over the paint before outlining everything in gold to give some depth to some areas. I used a white watercolor pencil to sketch on the hieroglyphics before going over them with gold metallic paint. I know these aren't super accurate hieroglyphics, but they were the closest thing I could do with what I could find on Google. Now we're coming up to parts of more lost footage. So if stuff slows down a lot, that's to give me time to explain what's missing. For her fabric, I dyed some chiffon with diluted brown alcohol ink that I thinned out with more isopropyl alcohol. This gave the chiffon a bit of an aged look. Then with a crinkled tan fabric and hot glue, I created a base for the mummy. I wanted her dress to be skin tight, and I had also this idea of it being asymmetrical and almost like her bandages had unraveled, creating this beautiful flowing skirt. The chiffon that I dyed, I ended up rolling and cutting into long strips and gluing and wrapping those around the dress base. This dress actually clasps in the back with some magnets, so it's removable from the doll. Let's start creating our head pieces. For the first one, I measured her head with a piece of note card and glued it together, and then created the top part of the headpiece with more note card. This took a little bit of trial and error to get the shape I wanted. Then I painted it and began sketching out other detailed parts. I used hot glue to give the cobra some dimension. For her second headpiece, I wanted to create a Cleopatra-inspired wig. I used plastic and hot glue to create a wig cap and glued down strands of yarn to give them the illusion that they were braided. I then sectioned and brushed out some of the pieces for some bangs and straightened them with my mini straightener. I used some scissors to cut the bangs and went in with a smaller pair to shorten them little by little until I got the length I wanted. I used pieces of coffee stirs for the ends of her hair and dipped them in gold metallic paint. I also created a little headband with UV resin jewels. I know it took a while, but we finally got here. Now this freaky group of friends is complete. And if you liked this doll, be sure to give this video a like, and if you want to see more dolls in the future, don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bells. Thanks for watching. See you next time.